Tokyo Game Life, a Tokyo-based video game podcast focusing on Nintendo and gaming culture in Japan's capital. Your host Mono here to bring you a slice of gaming life from Tokyo. We're kicking off this episode with the game section as I chat about Wizardry, Proving Grounds of the Mad Overlord, the remaster of the original iconic dungeon crawler. But it's not just me, as I got a chance to chat with the co-creator of the Wizardry franchise, Robert Woodhead, and Digital Eclipse's Justin Bailey about the revival of one of the most important games ever. We dig into the original game's legacy, how the new remaster is making it accessible for modern audiences, and very important typos. And the game section continues as I chat about another revival of a classic RPG, Paper Mario: The Thousand-Year Door on Switch. And in the feature segment, I take you to Machida, the inspiration for Pokemon's Pallet Town, and guide you on how to find the city's hidden Pokemon. Let's start with the game section and Wizardry, Proving Grounds of the Mad Overlord, with Robert Woodhead and Justin Bailey. Today we're going to be looking at Wizardry, Proving Grounds of the Mad Overlord from Digital Eclipse, based on the first game in the Wizardry franchise. But of course, I'm not alone, as I'm joined by two very special guests. So guests, please introduce yourself.
My name is Robert Woodhead, and I'm one of the authors of the original Wizardry game.
Justin Bailey, and I work for Digital Eclipse and Publishing.
Thank you so much for joining me. For those who don't know, Robert, what is Wizardry?
Wizardry is an early dungeon crawler game, released first in 1981.
Anything else? Would you say that it's an important game that came out?
I'll leave it to other people to comment on its importance, but certainly it's been a well-loved game over the years and has spawned many sequels. And certainly I had a great deal of fun writing the game. And here we are 40 years later, and we're still talking about it.
Yes. Yeah, its influence really can't be overstated. It was the first adaptation of a D&D style tabletop game into a video game. If you played Baldur's Gate 3 last year, well, this is the beginning of that. And that game owes quite a lot to Wizardry. Even if you're going to play Paper Mario soon on Switch, that game owes more to Wizardry than you'd expect. For one, Wizardry was the first RPG with a party that you could control. But for you, Robert, what do you think is the standout element of the first Wizardry game?
That's actually a very difficult question to answer because in many ways we were sort of making it up as we went along, and most of the decisions that were made in the game were, oh, that seems like a good idea to do this. But I will correct you in that Wizardry really wasn't the first computer game of this type. There were games before Wizardry that inspired Wizardry, many of them on the Plato system, which was a early computer network that had games that were literally 15 to 20 years ahead of their time. We're talking early 1970s multiplayer nationwide gaming. But Wizardry was just myself and Andy Greenberg, the other author of the game. It was just our attempt to take aspects of those games and the experience of playing tabletop Dungeons and Dragons style games and see how much of that we could cram into these dinky little Apple computers. But I think the thing that we really got right in the game was the gameplay loop. Although at the time, gameplay loops hadn't been invented yet.
Right.
In Wizardry, it was really pretty simple in terms of you go down in the dungeon, you fight some monsters, but you always have that tension. But can I stretch my luck and get another encounter, or do I need to go back and recharge? And I decide I'm going to go back and recharge, and you're almost to the exit, and then you get an encounter, and like, am I going to completely lose everything because I pushed it too far? And that kind of tension is, I think, a big part of what made the game what it was. And the fun thing is when I see the remake that was done, and also some of the other games that other people have done in Wizardry, the Wizardry Daphne game, which is coming out soon for phones, they all have that same kind of tension. And so it's very nostalgic for me to see that again.
And now it's being remade, or perhaps more accurately remastered for modern consoles, including the Nintendo Switch, Wizardry, Proving Grounds of the Mad Overlord. Justin, can you fill us in on how this project came to be?
Yeah, the project, Wizardry, 40 years, right? It's been around. And it wasn't available commercially for about 20 years. And it held a near and dear place in my heart. And so I had worked at Double Fine previously, and I helped do the re-release of Grim Fandango. That was another title that commercially was unavailable for 15 years. And when it came out, I think watching the fan base really activate around it was a very gratifying experience. And that wasn't a game that I had grown up with. So I saw Wizardry as one I had grown up with. And yeah, I was thinking to myself, how can I be a part of helping bring that back? And so found Digital Eclipse and connected with Robert here. And then it led to a bunch of partners that we're talking to. The Suritex, Dracom, and this whole trail of rights that we got to go down. But at the end of it is this amazing remake or remaster. And the team at Digital Eclipse, when approached with this prospect, found out that a lot of them, they loved Wizardry. They're fans. And one of the engineers in particular was looking at this as a challenge. To how can we do something that would stay true to what Robert and Andy had created, but be updated for a new audience? And I don't know if you're familiar with Monkey Island and how they did the switch back and forth between the old version. And that was another thing that was really inspiring. And so the team decided they want to take it to a different level. And what they did is they took the original Pascal code. And this one engineer did this where he took it and converted it to C++. That we put that in Unreal. So we have the core logic, the exact logic. As
bugs and all.
Yeah. Yes, we can get to that a little bit. And then we built on top of it, obviously, brand new graphics and a new UI. And you can use your controller now and new sound. Like Winifred did a new composition for it. And so now we have this new presentation, but also staying true to the old one. So it's actually accurate to say, long-winded answer. Where we put this in is kind of a new category, which is it's a port and a remaster.
Why was it important to use the original code? Why not just make it from the ground up in the Unreal Engine?
So that's Digital Eclipse as a studio always likes to be true and authentic to the original work. And so when you play this game, and one of the things I think, frankly, would love to hear Robert's take on this, is that the team presented their work to Robert to see his impression. And so, yeah, Robert, you came to the studio,
right.
You sat down, and we booted up the games. And what was kind of your take?
It was really interesting because I hadn't seen my code in that way in almost 35, 40 years. But that just blew me away when I saw it. I thought, wow, that was such a great decision to make, was that you can pop up a little picture-in-picture window showing the original presentation of the game, as well as, at the same time, the new presentation of the game. And you can see that they're in absolute lockstep. So you can see that the actual game itself, the game loop and all the decisions and all the dice rolls and all that sort of stuff is exactly the same as it was 40 years ago. But now, since we have a computer with literally thousands of times more processing power and graphics power and all that sort of stuff, you can present that very same game in a much more graphically compelling way. And it was very interesting for me as a programmer to see how that different environment and different set of limitations that they had versus what I had sort of guided their decisions about how they would do things and where they would spend those resources. And every time I looked at a particular part of the game and thought, how would I have solved this problem or done some particular thing, their solution was either exactly the same as, yeah, I would have done that myself, or, oh, wow, they actually thought of something that I didn't think of. So I was really pleased with the end result. And I think it provides a way for the old school gamers who already know what Wizardry is about to kind of see it in a new way, in a more modern way, but also the newer gamers who haven't seen Wizardry before, they can look at the two side by side and they can see what it was to play these kind of games in the early days, but still have the same sort of graphical presentation and quality of life features that modern games have.
How do you feel about your code you wrote nearly 40 years ago being used in a game today?
I think it's pretty cool, actually. Although that means that more people have seen my code, and so more people know all of the mistakes I made and sort of the clunkiness. Because at the time, of course, I thought I was the greatest programmer that had ever lived. But in reality, I was a young kid. I'd taken some college programming courses. I practiced a lot, obviously, because I was a real computer nerd. But I'm a much better programmer now than I was then. And so I'm sure that if I went back and looked over the code line by line, I'd be going, oh, I can't believe I did it that way. But that said, everything sort of worked out when we did the original game. All the spirit of all those decisions that we made has carried through into the new game. And so I'm really happy about that.
Justin, Digital Eclipse is known for retro game collections. Was there ever any thought at Digital Eclipse about a Wizardry collection? Or was the original idea always just to focus on making a new version of the old game?
That's a great question.
It's a question you've been asked several times.
Right now, I think the focus is really just on this first step, which is the remaster. I think it's really exciting to think about those other games and potential re-release in the future. But right now, no plans. It's the remaster's coming out, and the time that we're recording this, it'll be about 10 days. And we're just excited to see the reaction of that. We had done it already for early access. We were getting PC gamers, we were getting some feedback, which has been great, by the way. So it's a very positive rating on Steam. And then also, even more important to us was to see people were what they enjoyed, but also potential pieces that we could smooth over. So that's been invaluable for us. And then now that we have the console version coming out, we've been able to smooth all those rough edges off, and now we can expand it to a new audience. And we're hopeful that they'll see the treatment we've given it, and they'll see it as authentic, true to the original work, but bringing something new and fresh to it.
The game is intended to be faithful to the original game, but there are some quality of life additions as well. Justin, can you touch on trying to balance these new additions while also trying to maintain the appeal of the original game?
Yeah, and that also goes back to the early access, which was a lot of fun. When we went out in early access, there wasn't even a save slot. It just automatically saved at certain points, and you couldn't really access that. You would stop, and then when you booted it back up, you would resume, much how the first game saved it. But we were talking about this in the original game. If you were about to get a party wipe, you had the option to actually yank the disk out and keep it from writing. In this game, you don't, of course, because there's no floppy drive. So in a way, it was true, and the quality of life improvements weren't in there at the time. So it was actually harder than the original. That was fun to see people and then all the animations weren't done. So you could complete the game, but we'd have placeholders on some of the animations that would come later. But during that whole next period, from early access to now, the focus has been on getting that quality of life piece correct. And it's key to the game. We want to be true to the original material, but also approachable to new gamers. And so the defaults that we've now come up with is kind of a hybrid between the two. So when you come in the game, you can almost 3 button presses on your controller. You can get right into the dungeon. You can start exploring. That party you have is a little bit, it's first off, it's pre-made. In the original game, you had to go in and you had to go through these manuals, right? And to figure out, it could take 30 minutes to an hour. And if you were trying to roll the dice to get the most optimal solution, which I think happened here in Japan a lot, per hour, it could be more time than that. So we streamlined the process. Now, of course, you can see, you just use your controller. We've taken up all the elements from the manual so you can actually see it in there, but also have a point system so you can allocate the points rather than having to roll it, and then create your original party. You can go in the dungeon and start exploring. But the important thing to us was that if people wanted that original experience, they could go in and turn on all those old school components, which we've done. So I would say one particular challenge, though, we ran into was the auto mapper. So games of this time, you'll know they have spinners, they have teleport traps, darkness and stuff, which was all part of you getting your graph paper out and mapping it. So how do you do that with an auto mapper? Because this game was not designed for an auto mapper. So we had the auto mapper in early access. And one of the things that would happen is this kind of unreliable narrator thing existed. So if you're in a place and you don't really know where you are, the auto mapper would kind of get confused. And so what we had is people were playing it and they're like, this is broken, because they didn't go and look at it and it'd be all messed up. It's just that your character doesn't actually know where they are. So it actually ended up the fix to that was, instead of doing it one tile, make it the tiles that you can just see directly around the player. So now you would have the 8 tiles around the player update in the auto map. And then all of a sudden, nobody thought it was broken anymore. It just worked as it was supposed to work. And then we have the auto map functionality in there, right? But still, obviously, with the original game, original levels.
Robert, do you have any favorite quality of life addition to this new version, or something you wish you could have included in the original Apple II game?
Well, the mini-map obviously is something that I wish they'd been invented at the time we wrote the game. But that's a kind of a hard question to answer, because I still think of the game in terms of the original game that I wrote. As one of the developers of the original game, I don't think of it in terms of me playing the game. It's more of me play testing the game. When I actually played Wizardry, it was always in the feeling of play testing it, because I was always like, oh, somebody reported a bug. I've got to go check it out. And so it's kind of hard to get in the mindset of a player when you're the guy who wrote the game.
Yeah.
So the quality of life stuff, those are all kind of the obvious things that we expect in a game today. And they were all things that either had never been thought of at the time we wrote the original game, or even if we had thought of them as, oh, we don't have enough space on the disk to add them.
Right.
So that's why that kind of question is almost an impossible one to ask me. Because if I was going to be playing the game, I'd turn them all off. Although I still think you need to have a little disk icon that pops up so that you can click it to simulate the yanking of the disk.
Right.
And I'm going to rag on you about that until you finally give up at it.
Yeah, that is something we'd have to look at for post-release.
Yeah, right. No, you have to hold up the release. Fix that.
Delay it.
I insist.
Yeah.
I do have a question regarding how faithful this new game is to the original. In the original game, there's a sword in the game. Is the sword in the remake called Muramasa or Murasama?
Oh, okay. We're getting into
The weeds.
So we have 8.4 did the translation. And that would be a question for them to answer. Unfortunately, they literally just walked out of the room. But that's why they're here in the audience, basically, to answer that. But no, it is the original game. So you have one piece. I'll just throw this back at Robert, because this is kind of cool. So for instance, it's warts and all. You call it bugs and all. If there were bugs, but one instance there was features,
Unanticipated features.
So there was an homage that was put in there to a famous property at the time that Wizardry was released. And you were talking about testing the game. And so there was a bit that got switched. And so we found this in the code. And apparently it turns out, Robert was saying, he was playtesting it and that encounter happened. And the bit got flipped because it's only a one-time occurrence. So the bit got flipped, and then they're like, okay, it works. And then they shut down and shipped the code. But the bit had been flipped on the code that got shipped.
Oh.
So nobody ever saw it.
Right.
So it's so faithful that even those pieces are still in there. There was another thing which is kind of cool, was our programmer found out, which was experience is calculated based on some of the stats for the monsters. So frost giants. There was apparently an error in the code of how it got calculated. And so when you fought that giant, you got more experience than what you would get based on just a flat stats and how it was done for all the other characters. But we fixed it, and they can't see my hands when I did my air quotes. And then the community came back and was like, the giants are broken. So we unfixed it.
Robert, can you fill us in on how the Muramasa sword came to be, along with its original spelling?
Well, back at the time that Wizardry was written, there was a bit of a blip in terms of understanding of Japanese culture in the U.S., mostly driven by the book and the miniseries Shogun. And so we love that show. I mean, and by the way, the new show is really good. But anyway, so there's a lot of things that got kind of put into Wizardry just because we thought they were cool. I mean, there's Monty Python references and the reference he was talking about, which is to Thundar the Barbarian.
Yes.
So we sort of said, well, Japanese stuff is cool. We want to put cool stuff in our games. So the samurais and ninjas and so on and so forth. And so we wanted to put some kind of Japanese weapons in the game. And that's where the Murasama blade came from, except it's actually Muramasa, but typo, didn't read it right. So it got put in incorrectly. So but the bizarre thing about it is that because of the Japanese references that probably made it more popular here in Japan. And Japan is where Wizardry has kind of been sustained over the last 20, 30 years. It's always had this really kind of cult status here. And I think if we hadn't watched that TV show, then maybe this would never happen. And it just shows you how contingent things are and how just these purely little random things can have massive butterfly effect type results 40 years later.
And the release date for 1.0 of this Wizardry remaster was announced not too long ago. Digital Eclipse tweeted it out, and it got about 385 likes. The Japanese Wizardry account tweeted the same information, and it got over 5,000 likes. So touching on what you just said, Wizardry has a really fascinating legacy in Japan. Is the interest in Wizardry in Japan just because there was a Muramasa blade, or is there something deeper to it than that?
It's really hard to say, and I'm not sure that I'm the right person to ask that question. But I think one reason is that it was one of the first role-playing games to come over from the US. The first time I came to Japan, it was to help with the localization of the game, which was a very interesting project on its own. And so as it's one of the first ones to come over, and because it was localized and came out on basically every PC platform in Japan, it had a disproportionate impact. And then eventually the Famicom version came out. And personally, I think until this new remaster, the Famicom version was the best version of Wizardry. And I had absolutely nothing to do with it, which is very embarrassing.
And there are a lot of Japanese exclusive Wizardry titles. And since the game is coming to Nintendo Switch, I've really been interested in Wizardry's history as a portable game. But first, Justin, what can you tell us about the Nintendo Switch version of Wizardry Proving Grounds of the Mad Overlord?
The Switch version, I think the focus for us was on bringing the Japanese language. I think you'll see the console versions and the PC version are a parity across the Switch and Sony PlayStation 4 and 5 and Xbox. But the thing we did notice right away, and you mentioned this about the tweets, we were selling the second best-selling territory after the US was basically Japan. And at the time, we had no Japanese translations. And so we're, okay, well, we need to get this right. So that's when we reached out to A4, and they've done a wonderful job. So I'm really excited for the Japanese audience to get to see that. But one of the reasons we didn't actually add that to the early access side is because we were, it's so popular here and near and dear to this area that we wanted to make sure we got it right.
And there are many Japanese developers who have outright said Wizardry inspired their games, perhaps the most famous being Yuji Horii, the creator of Dragon Quest. And from Dragon Quest, we have so many other JRPGs. Perhaps a straighter line would be the Etrian Odyssey series or the Mystery Dungeon series. Robert, when you first started to play Japanese games that were inspired by Wizardry, were you surprised or amazed about how they utilized Wizardry's core ideas into what essentially became a new genre of gaming?
I only have really secondhand knowledge of that because I haven't played too many of the Japanese games, or at least I haven't played them. It's kind of weird because I get the most fun out of writing software and doing things like that. So I'm not a huge gamer. I play games.
Right.
So it's every couple of years a game will come out that I'll obsess over for a few weeks, but it's not like I'm continually playing them. The knowledge I get of Japanese games is always secondhand, people telling me, somebody said this. Last year, I met Hori-san for the first time.
Oh, wow. Last year?
Yeah. And so in preparation for that meeting, I'd played Dragon Quest before a little bit, but I replayed the game a little bit. And I could tell after I met him, I could see his personality in the game, okay, his sense of humor, and I could see the influences of Wizardry and Ultima in that game. But I could also see how and in particular, how he had done what all good game designers do, which is they try to make the best use of the resources that they have. And in particular, in Japanese games, one of the things that really kind of molded them in the early days was that Japanese computers were much better at tile graphics than US computers were, in part because they had to handle kanji.
Yes.
Okay. And so you could see when you're playing that game how he had really exploited that particular strength and squeezed the most he could out of it. And that allowed him to spend more resources on sort of narrative aspects of the game, which in the early parts of Wizardry, the narrative is fairly simple and a lot of it is lore that's outside the game in the manual and stuff. Whereas in the Japanese game, because of the different limitations, he was able to put more of it actually into the gameplay experience, which as a designer working at the same time that he was on that game, I could really appreciate.
The RPG and dungeon crawler genre has come a long way since Wizardry's original release. So, Justin, how does this game appeal to experienced players in the genre in 2024?
And then one thing I think I've heard the one about Dragon Quest before, and the other inspirations that occur, which I haven't heard many people make the correlation, is Demon Souls. So one thing that happened in Wizardry is if your party did get wiped, you could actually put a new party together and then go down to the dungeon and grab their bodies and get the equipment and stuff.
Yes.
And that was something you never really saw happen again until Demon's Souls came back. And that was one of the inspirations that actually led to that design in that game. So it's cool to see something like that happen 30 years after Wizardry. I think it shows just how far-reaching.
It was such a bad idea that it took 30 years before somebody tried the game.
Justin, do you have any tips or advice for people coming to Wizardry for the first time thanks to this new release?
Yeah, we smoothed it over a little bit. My advice to those people, if they want a challenge, go turn all the old school options on. But if they want, we have tuned it with the options that are on. So it would be about part of them, which you would expect from most of the games. But that's Wizardry. That's part of its appeal. And if you've been exposed to it before, open the menu up, look at all the options that you have to kind of tweak it so it can be the experience you want. If not, if this is your first time, then jump in the dungeon and start doing a few battles and just play this classic in a new presentation, but actually the same logic and balancing or the same logic tables and the same monsters and everything as it was when it was released 40 years ago.
What about you, Robert? What advice would you give to people coming to Wizardry for the first time?
Don't push your luck.
Yes.
Yeah, that's the number one thing Wizardry players learn really quickly is you've got to really be aware of the risk reward in terms of going a little deeper, or I don't want to waste the time of going back to town to rest up my characters and get my hit points back.
Right.
And many, many Wizardry adventures have ended with getting killed 2 steps away from the exit, which is convenient when you want to go down and pick them up again.
Yeah, of course. Robert, do you have a favorite floor of the maze or maybe just a favorite trap?
Oh, wait, which one's your initials?
Yeah, we did. It's just our initials are in the maze, both of us. But I don't even remember what level that is. Let's see. I don't really think that I have a favorite. Actually, my favorite version of the game was the original playtest version we did, which the code was mostly working, but the dungeon was ridiculously unbalanced. You could basically run into the devil on level 1, and this is a version that we actually sold at a computer game convention a few months before. It was basically a beta test, although this was before beta testing had been invented.
Right.
And so we actually sold the test version at the convention and then told people, well, we'll send you the final version when it comes out. And so that version was called the Dungeons of Despair. And there's those original diskettes. They're few and far between, but I'm told people still have hung on to them. And so that version of the game with all its terrible flaws and the bugs that we still hadn't stomped, I guess because it was actually the first time other people had gotten a chance to play it, I'd say that was my favorite.
Okay, final question for both Justin and Robert. What's the thing that most excites you about people getting their hands on the finished version of this game?
The money?
No. Yeah, I think it goes back to Robert when I was really excited for Robert to get to see when we were early in development, the approach the team was taking with the game. Because I know when I got my hands on it and sat down and saw the Apple II graphics basically on the screen and then picked up a controller and actually started to operate. That was a crazy moment for me. This is amazing. It was like this weird thing about blending the old and new. So that's what I hope. I hope people that if it's something that they grew up with, that they see there and appreciate the detail that was put into it. And if it's something new, and we've seen this at some conventions and stuff where we saw a father and a son, and the father was playing the old school one on Apple II, and the son was sitting there playing the new one on a console. That was an amazing moment. So I hope it's kind of intergenerational and everybody can kind of appreciate the seminal game that helped kind of get the JRPG genre going.
What about you, Robert?
Well, obviously, I hope people enjoy the game and have fun with it, playing it as I had writing it. I mean, I'm constantly amazed that 40 years later, this silly thing that I did in a desperate attempt to avoid actually having to get a real job actually worked, and in fact resulted in me never having to get a real job. So eternally grateful for that. I would just say I hope that the new players enjoy it as much as the original Wizardry players enjoyed it.
Awesome. Well, that was a look at Wizardry, Proving Grounds of the Mad Overlord, both old and new. Robert Woodhead and Justin Bailey, thanks for joining me.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
So it's 2024 and Wizardry is back, but you know what else is back? That's right, a game that may not exist without Wizardry kicking off this whole video game RPG thing, Paper Mario: The Thousand-Year Door. This is a full-blown remake of the 2004 GameCube sequel to Paper Mario, and Intelligent Systems is indeed handling it. When it comes to Paper Mario, I don't want to see it just handed off to another dev. Arte Piazza did an amazing job with Super Mario RPG, but for those first two Paper Mario games, I do think it's important for the original company and even some of the original devs to have their hands on it. Ryota Kawade, the chief director of the original two games, returns here as the ambiguous supervisor. This is actually his first game credit since Codename Steam, since he was on the now defunct Fire Emblem Cypher card game. He seems to be very hands-off these days, which is kind of sad because he directed some amazing games. I could probably do an episode entirely just about the legacy of The Thousand-Year Door. The original sold a couple of million, probably turned a tidy profit, but I would certainly call it a cult classic in some ways due to how the game is evangelized by the hardcore, very vocal fans. Since the Paper Mario series took a hard pivot from RPGs to, not RPGs, or things that are RPG light, it does serve as the ultimate example of the potential of a Mario RPG for many people. Me though, I definitely rank Paper Mario 64 above The Thousand-Year Door. Paper Mario is maybe my favorite game ever. It's either that or Super Mario World. Again, something like Tears of the Kingdom is probably better than Paper Mario, but I think that's just a perfect game in so many ways. So I was really hyped for The Thousand-Year Door as a kid, and while I certainly enjoyed the game a lot, I did walk away thinking, Paper Mario 64 is better. I think the biggest issue I had was the pacing of the game and the backtracking, which I do think is somewhat infamous. So I am curious to come back to the game all these years later and see if my opinion has changed or if Intelligent Systems put in a lot of new additions to smooth over those rough edges. So far, I'm having a lot of fun with the remake, and there are some great additions for people who have memorized every element of the original. It's a very faithful remake, but Intelligent Systems is not shy about changing things. This is what I want from a remake. I prefer some things to be remixed or just made more interesting than just treating the original game like it was some sort of infallible object. In terms of new content, there's not a whole lot. There's a purple toad that pops up every now and then whom you can practice attacks against. There's also a neat art gallery and a few extra boss fights, but most of the best changes are small things that add up. There's edge guarding now, so you won't just fall into the water. There are more warp pipes to help you navigate the world. One of the more noticeable ones from the presentation standpoint is now all the dialogue scenes are voiced via the type sound effects. This adds a ton of personality to the game. It's just a simple thing, but it adds so much. I don't want to go over the rest of the changes because there are literally hundreds of them. And if you've never played the game before, you probably don't care that the battle theme now changes based on if the enemy got first strike or not. But all the changes I have noticed have been for the better, and it does give hardcore fans who have played this game over and over again new things to experience. But let's talk about the actual game. I'm not too far into it, I've cleared Chapter 2, but as expected, the game does hold up incredibly well. It has such a dynamic and fun battle system that only gets better as you go along, since you get access to many amazing badge abilities that let you execute a lot of fun attacks in battle. It's very easy for an RPG battle system to grow dull or become stale, but Thousand-Year Door has a great one that just keeps surprising you. Like I said with Super Mario RPG last year, there's just something inherently fun about timing button presses in an RPG battle. It's the simplest thing in the world, but it always works. And the game builds on the badge system of the original, where you can equip them to Mario, which grants him special moves, abilities, and just general power-ups. There's dozens of them, and each one really does feel like it has game-changing potential. You're going to want that multi-bounce badge early on, trust me. It is smart to buff your HP and FP a little bit, but you need to spend most of your level ups on increasing your BP so you can equip more and more badges. It's fun to start off with just your piddly little 1 damage jump, then suddenly you have like 8 specialized jump attacks that all do different things, thanks to the badges. I also like the designs of the badges themselves. They look like kind of crystal pin badges. Why isn't Nintendo selling these things? Make a blind box badge. Come on, this is free money. But beyond the stellar battle system, a big part of the game's appeal and why it has such hardcore fans is the storytelling and setting. The story is not amazing conceptually. Peach is kidnapped, and Mario needs to collect 7 stars to free her. But on your journey to get them, you visit unusual places with instantly memorable characters that's often backed up with a funny script. The standout location is easily Rogueport, which serves as the game's hub. It's a seedy port filled with pirates and thieves, something you wouldn't expect in a Mario game at all. It has a bit of an edge to it, but it's not dark in a serious way. Everyone is still very goofy, and the thieves are like, man, I love stealing. But it's just such an uncharacteristically grimy locale for Mario. The futuristic X-Nauts also stand out as a distinct threat. We're in the Mario world, but we are seeing a side of it that hasn't really appeared in the franchise before or since. And for Mario hardcores, it's just fun to see all the obscure enemies roaming around Rogueport, like Mousers and bandits. Rogueport is where you stop in between chapters to move the story along and to buy things, but it's crammed with a ton of secrets and interesting places to visit. There's also a side quest board that sends you all over the city to do tasks for the locals. It really is an excellent hub area, one you're excited to visit in between chapters, and not just because you get to hear an exciting, totally factual Luigi story. Let's talk about the worst change though. It's now 30 FPS as opposed to the original game's 60 FPS. Now, 60 FPS is better than 30 at all times. I live my life 60 frames at a time, and you should too. However, it's never been a deal breaker for me. If a game is 30, it's 30. I'm still going to play it. And considering how richly textured the graphics in the world is, I do understand Intelligent Systems saying, let's keep it at 30 so we can pull off more interesting visual effects. I do think this has a negative effect when it comes to menus and animation though. There's definitely a bit of menu lag, which you kind of don't want in a menu-based RPG. The flow of a battle or item management does feel slower than it should. For one, when you get the stars to boost your meter, I don't think it's necessarily a frame rate problem, but after each turn, there's a pause, then the stars come from the audience, they swirl and go into your star bar, so these seconds really add up. Also, like I mentioned before, the game does have a pretty absurd amount of backtracking. Since the level design is very reminiscent of a 2D side-scroller, you often go back and forth these hallway-esque sections of the map. I just did the tree dungeon, and man, you really gotta go up the tree, then down the tree, then back up the tree, then back down with the punies, then farther down with them, then go back up to get them, then back down again. The game really likes to stretch out these small areas. There are more warp pipes which helps mitigate this, but it's clear that Paper Mario's level and world design has come a long way. Origami King, whatever you may think about that game's battle system, the level design is excellent. They toss you into these large areas with a lot of secrets to find and optional places to explore. There's also a lot of fun puzzles and mini games to encounter. Obviously, the ultimate dream would be for them to take the level design of Origami King and marry it with the battle system and character growth of the Thousand Year Door. You can make this game, Intelligent Systems. No one is stopping you. At least I don't think so. But looping back around to some positive elements, the game looks amazing and the soundtrack is even better than ever. It's going for a different art style that's much more focused on realistic lighting, and Mario is made up of parts as opposed to just being one big cutout. The graphics have more depth to them, and I like a lot of the other smaller touches like the menu backgrounds, for some segments are made of paper with wrinkles and unique shading. I would say overall it's definitely a bit darker visually, like do a one-to-one comparison between the GameCube and Switch versions. The GameCube version does look like a picture book, while the Switch version has more of a diorama feel. I can see some people maybe preferring the GameCube art style since it's much more vivid, but I do like how IS is pretty experimental with Paper Mario's visuals. I think eventually you do run into a wall in terms of making the most realistic paper ever. The soundtrack is also way more vibrant and rich. Again, this is just the benefit of technology and getting to remix the original existing tracks. But there is a badge that lets you listen to the original GameCube music if you are that nostalgic. Like last year's Super Mario RPG, it is the best looking and best sounding remake it could possibly be. Though, sorry Paper Mario, you can't top Yoko Shimomura, no matter how hard you try. It's both somewhat crazy and fascinating that Nintendo put out 2 remakes of beloved Mario RPGs in a 6-month span. Super Mario RPG in November, and now this one. They are pretty different though. Super Mario RPG is basically a Dragon Quest styled Mario game, while Paper Mario is much more distinct in terms of its battle system, character growth, and overworld exploration. And it's great for me that they were released so closely together because now I can just compare them and say which one is better. Not this episode though. I do want to let credits roll on Thousand Year Door, but please look forward to my ultimate Paper Mario ranking in a future episode. And by ultimate, I mean I didn't play Sticker Star or Color Splash or Paper Jam, but the rest, I've got it covered. Alright, that's all for games. Now let's move on to the feature on Machida, the real-life Pallet Town. Alright, today's feature is on the real-life Pallet Town, Machida, in the vast Tokyo metropolis. Now, how is this the real-life Pallet Town? Well, its claim to fame is that Machida is the hometown of Satoshi Tajiri, the creator of Pokemon. Here is where it all began, where the concept of Pokemon was born, and while there's no giant Satoshi Tajiri museum yet, the city does celebrate the series with the installation of 6 Poké-Lids. So yes, this is going to be a quasi-sequel to the Poké-Lids feature I did with Alola Pixie a few episodes ago. If you want all the deets on Poké-Lids, please check out that episode. Today I want to focus mainly on exploring Machida, finding the Poké-Lids, and other unexpected fun things you can find in, yes, the real-life Pallet Town. Now, if you don't know, a lot of the places in Pokemon are based on real-life locations, especially early on in those first 4 generations that take place in quote-unquote Japan. A lot will fly completely over your head if you've never been to Japan, and many of those places are based on kind of non-touristy areas, or places that aren't really famous. Obviously, Mount Silver is Mount Fuji, but I don't think a whole lot of people know about Machida off the top of their head. And yes, I know some people have said that Pallet Town is based on a place in Shizuoka, because if you overlay the Pokemon Kanto map with Japan, it's closer to Shizuoka. But that doesn't make sense because these places weren't meant to be exactly one-to-one, and Tajiri is from Machida, and the installation of the Poké-Lids pretty much confirms that Pallet Town is supposed to be Machida, or at least heavily inspired by it. Shizuoka currently has 0 Poké-Lids, which honestly is a bit surprising. But for those who haven't listened to my Poké-Lids episode just yet, Poké-Lids are Pokemon-themed utility lid covers that are installed all over Japan to promote local tourism. So you go to visit the Poké-Lids because you're a big Pokemon nerd, but you also enjoy the other activities in the area. And most importantly, spend some money. All the lids have colorful, one-of-a-kind art of the Pokemon, and they're often inspired by the area's local culture or customs. They're mostly in off-the-beaten-path travel locations. Tokyo City itself only has 2 out of the 300 plus installed all over Japan. But Machida, which is in the Tokyo Prefecture, but not in the city proper, has 6 of them. So, off to Machida I went to find all the Poké-Lids and see what else it had to offer. The city of Machida itself, at first it just seems like every single suburb or extension of Tokyo you've ever seen. When you step out of the station, you'll see the usual department stores and restaurants and streets. Obviously, it's changed quite a bit from when Satoshi Tajiri was a kid in the 70s, but there are still places in Machida that do evoke the quaint, homey nature of Pallet Town. Stop 1 was obviously Setagaya Park, where all 6 Poké-Lids are housed. It's not too far from the station, so you can easily find it when you hop off the train. I did some research and the park opened up in 1982, so no, it's not the exact spot where Tajiri hunted for bugs, which then served as the inspiration for Pokemon. But it is a huge, lush park with some giant sculptures, an event area that's filled with food trucks, and plenty of quiet spots, including ponds filled with ducks and koi fish. Poké-Lids aside, I was quite impressed by the park overall. There is just so much greenery, and it feels less artificial than a lot of parks. Grass is allowed to be a bit overgrown, there are bubbling streams, and ducks roam around. It would certainly be worth checking out even if there were 0 Poké-Lids. But fortunately, there are. Saved to my phone, I had a map of the park with the location of the Poké-Lids. On the official Poké-Lids website, you can just look up each lid and get a precise Google Map location, but the pic I had was kind of a cartoony rendition of the park, yet was also incredibly accurate, so it was like a fun scavenger hunt where I had to keep referring to the map. Almost like a mini-map, literally. The first lid you'll come across is close to the entrance of the park and in front of this giant twisting sculpture. It's Pidgey and Rattata with a bit of Pikachu's tail on the very edge. The lid also has a picture of the sculpture which you can see from the lid. It's always really cool how the lids are so smartly designed and try to integrate the local area's unique elements onto the design of the lid. Around the same sculpture is Squirtle. The sculpture is in the middle of a man-made fountain, so I guess Squirtle would hang out there. All the lids are pretty much in places where you would theoretically find the Pokemon. The Poliwag lid is near some water, the Weedle, Caterpie, and Oddish lid are next to some trees. Perhaps the funniest one is Charmander, which is not too far from a fire hazard warning. I mean, that can't be a coincidence, right? The ultimate lid, of course, being Bulbasaur, is likely the last one you'll find, as it's the furthest back in the park next to some shrubs. While Charmander and Squirtle look like they have the legs of Red on the design, Bulbasaur actually has Leaf. The socks and the skirt are a dead giveaway, so it's cool to see this character get a bit of recognition. There were definitely a few people in the park who were aware of the Poké-Lids and were hunting them down too to take pictures. It's nice to see everyone so excited about seeing them, and the whole point of Poké-Lids was to get people to visit areas they probably wouldn't normally check out otherwise. I mean, if there were no Poké-Lids, I can't say I would have ever visited Machida. After the park, I went for lunch. I wasn't sure if Machida was famous for any food, so I was just searching around for restaurants when one caught my eye. Genie's. It's your typical Japanese steak restaurant where the meat is served on a big, sizzling hot plate. But what caught my eye is that the shape of the restaurant looks like a big boat. It's not a repurposed boat by any means, it's just the shape of one, with anchors and porthole windows and everything. Inside also has a lot of nautical maps and similar theming. Why? Honestly, I have no idea. The name Genie's itself may be inspired by Disney because the TVs inside of the restaurant were showing Beauty and the Beast, so maybe some Disney otaku is running the joint. Oh, and there was also a bunch of skeletons everywhere. Not spooky skeletons though, they were wearing these fun hats and sunglasses. The steak, it was pretty good. I wasn't disappointed. I can't say it's a must-visit restaurant, but it is fun to take pictures of from the outside. After lunch, I headed for what is likely Machida's most famous tourist attraction, Machida Squirrel Garden. This is a bit of a ways from the station, so you will need to take a bus for about 10 to 15 minutes to get there. Now, this place is basically a mini zoo, with the main attraction being the titular Squirrel Garden, where over 200 squirrels roam around. It's a big open area with interconnecting routes, and scattered throughout the place are a bunch of colorfully decorated birdhouses where the squirrels live. So not really birdhouses, I guess squirrel houses. To be honest, it didn't feel like 200 squirrels lived there, since I assume a lot were hiding in their house or in other areas, but you do see quite a few of them running around. And the best part is that yes, you can feed the squirrels. You pay a couple hundred yen for an oven mitt and some sunflower seeds, and they will eat right out of your hand. This is probably the closest I've ever been to a squirrel. They don't seem to be scared by humans as long as you have food. I didn't try to pet the squirrels while they were eating though. I probably wouldn't want to be petted during a meal. But it is a unique area, basically a mini zoo solely dedicated to squirrels. There are parts of the garden dedicated to other animals like turtles and parrots and guinea pigs, but you're here for the squirrels. The gift shop also has a ton of squirrel merch if that's what you're into. Either way, though, it's a fun little place to check out that offers a unique experience. Now, right across from the street of the Squirrel Garden is Yakushi Ike Park, yet another park overflowing with greenery, but this one has more of a Japanese style to it. There's a huge pond in the middle with arched bridges, which makes for some great photo ops. In terms of scenery, this easily tops Setagaya Park, but that park is a bit more family-oriented, while Yakushi Ike Park is a place you visit to quietly contemplate. It has some flowers and plants you'd expect, like the Japanese maple trees, but one of these standout sections was this wisteria garden, where the wisteria plants hang overhead and you can walk under them. I've seen a few places have the same sort of setup, and it doesn't get old when the wisteria are in bloom. Again, just great photo ops. Further in the park, you can also see kind of a small farm with terraced areas and old Edo-era buildings. The whole area was just wonderfully atmospheric, and going back to Machida being Pallet Town, these parks do evoke the feeling of exploring nature and catching Pokemon. Even though so much has changed from Tajiri's childhood, there are still places that capture the rustic and quiet atmosphere of where your Pokemon adventure began. After the park, I went back to the station and hung around the main shopping area for a bit. There's a hobby off where I did find a cheap version of Pokemon Gold for only 800 yen, but there's also a book off with quite an expansive retro game area. It's actually decorated with plushies and posters, including a really cool psychedelic-looking Super Mario World poster where Mario is giving the peace sign, and he's surrounded by all the power-ups. It kind of looks like a mandala. And yes, I did manage to find a copy of Pokemon Red and Green in box, but both were over 5,000 yen. Man, I really should have bought every box copy of the Game Boy Pokemon games for 1,000 yen each when I had the chance. So that was my little excursion to Machida, the real-life Pallet Town. It's a very pleasant day trip from Tokyo, especially for those like me who have been here for years and are kind of wondering if there are any worthwhile day trips left. The answer is always yes, as Tokyo is deceptively huge and areas you never expect to be interesting can still thrill you. If you're visiting Tokyo with limited time, it might not be worth spending a whole afternoon here unless you badly want to see the Pokelids. Like, if your choice for a day trip is Nikko or Machida, go to Nikko. But if you live in Tokyo, this is a pleasant place to check out for a morning and afternoon. And now my Pokelid count has jumped from 2 to 8. Just 300 plus more to go. Oh, and I did make a little documentary about my trip and submit it to MinMax's Doc Lightning event, which is in a few days if you're listening to this day one, or it's already out if you're a bit late to listening to the podcast. So just check my YouTube channel to see if the video is there. Tokyo Game Life on YouTube. That's it for the feature. Now for some news. The most expensive news of the week is that LEGO revealed the heavily rumored Zelda set. It's the Deku Tree, but it actually has two versions, the Ocarina of Time Deku Tree and the one from Breath of the Wild. You can't build both at the same time, so you gotta choose one to display. It also comes with 4 minifigs, Kid and Adult Link from Ocarina of Time, and Zelda and Link from Breath of the Wild. The price? Just a breezy $300 or 41,000 yen. So yeah, it's an easy skip for me. I do like these minifigs though, but I don't think they're going to sell them individually. Maybe years down the line, but for now I can just look at them through glass or something. The price is pretty absurd though, especially the Japanese price. Lego is fairly popular here. There are Lego stores in Tokyo and even a Lego theme park, but every time I check them out, they're just so expensive. It's one of those hobbies you can't really just have casually. You gotta be all in on Lego. Even if I got this for free, there's zero room in my house to display it. The minifigs though, plenty of room. Some Tokyo related news. If you remember last year, I did a feature on a Pikachu themed afternoon tea set at a fancy hotel in Tokyo. Well, guess what? Eevee is jumping in with Eevee Friends Afternoon Tea starting this July. Not only limited to Tokyo though, there are dates in Yokohama, Chiba, Nagoya, Saitama, Miyagi, Kyoto, Osaka. But hey, I'm just going to go to the Tokyo one. It won't be in the same place as the Pikachu tea set though. This Eevee one will be held in Aoyama St. Grace Cathedral, which is a wedding venue. But you don't need to be getting married to enjoy the tea set. My wife is a big fan of afternoon tea, so I will be trying to get a reservation for this one. The Pikachu one wasn't that hard, but you do need to reserve a bit ahead of time. Last bit of news, Dragon Quest is back. Sorta. On Dragon Quest Day, the official accounts posted a teaser relating to Dragon Quest III HD 2D. They confirmed the platforms, which is all of them, including the Switch. Basically an announcement of an announcement, but since we had 3 years of radio silence when it comes to DQ3 HD 2D news, anything is welcome. I'm excited for the game, but also a bit curious to see what exactly they are going to add. DQ3 is already on the Switch via the ugly mobile ports, so I do feel like there needs to be some significant additions in terms of content to make people interested in the game. I'd love new classes, for example. But DQ3 is DQ3. It's an iconic game in the Japanese gaming pantheon, so you don't want to touch it too much. Maybe like Wizardry, there could be options. Do you want old school experience or something more geared towards a modern audience? If Square markets it correctly, or if Nintendo really helps push it as a major title, it should easily be a huge hit in Japan unless they totally botch it. I definitely want to jump back in though. DQ3 on the GBC was my first mainline Dragon Quest game. I thought it was quite hard and never completed it, so now I can make up for it all these years later. Unless I never complete this remake either, which means I have to wait another 20 years for another DQ3 remake. There is also the rumor that it might not just be DQ3 though, but instead the entire Loto trilogy, aka Dragon Quest 1, 2, and 3, all in HD 2D. I mean, cool, but Dragon Quest 3 is the best one, right? You could easily sell the HD 2D version of Dragon Quest 3 for $50 to $60. Not sure why they would put forth the tremendous effort to remake the other 2 games, instead of just adding fun things to Dragon Quest 3. But I expect we will see the game either at SGF or a Nintendo Direct at the latest. Alright, that's all for now. Thanks as always for listening. Be sure to like and subscribe to this podcast on your favorite app. Leave a 5-star review as well, it really helps. This podcast is also available on YouTube, so like and subscribe there as well. I'm on Twitter, Threads, Blue Sky, Instagram. Just search for Tokyo Game Life or find the links in the podcast description. If you like the podcast, be sure to share it with your friends and on social media. If there's anything you want me to talk about or cover, don't be shy, just message me on Twitter. The next episode will be on June 16th. See you next time. Matane!